Over Your Dead Body has a surprisingly happy ending, given just how bloody the rest of the film is. Jason Segel and Samara Weaving star in the film as Dan and Lisa, a married couple who have increasingly grown apart over time. Both of them see an opening to kill the other while on a vacation to a remote cabin. This leads to some comical murder attempts and a tense excuse to finally vent their biggest frustrations with one another. The real complication comes when they discover three dangerous strangers hiding in the house, forcing the feuding couple to come back together if they want any chance at survival. Directed by the Lonely Island veteran Jorma Taccone, Over Your Dead Body has a lot of real, grisly moments and emotional complexity that play into an overarching narrative about personal growth and empathy. The biggest surprise about the film is the way that it builds to a surprisingly happy ending. At the core of Over Your Dead Body is the drama between Dan and Lisa, which grows from simmering resentment and explosive rage to a surprisingly reconnected. Even though there are plenty of deaths by the end of the film, Over Your Dead Body eventually leans into an optimistic tone despite that otherwise bleak tone. Why Dan and Lisa want to kill each other, and how they get over it. Over Your Dead Body kicks off with the pair both quietly planning on killing the other during the trip. After this is exposed, both reveal their motivations. Dan has been miserable following career setbacks and his struggles to connect with Lisa, with the final straw being Lisa having an affair with a co-star in her latest play. Lisa admits to the affair but argues she only did it out of frustration with Dan, who spent almost all their money and has been wallowing in self-pity ever since. Both of them also admit that the insurance money payout for their partner's death would allow them to rebuild their lives. Their respective efforts to kill each other complicate matters for both of them, leading to the accidental death of Dan's accomplice. However, these confessions and confrontations help push Dan to defend himself and Lisa against Todd and his group. This pushes Dan to actually take agency in his life in a way his father and wife both doubted he could. The film's macabre sense of humor aside, Over Your Dead Body's impromptu counseling session between the pair actually resolves the tension between them, highlighting how open conversation and forgiveness can bring a couple back from the brink and reinvigorate their relationship. Why Pete, Todd, and Aldra attack Dan and Lisa. One of the big twists in Over Your Dead Body centers on the trio of Pete, Todd, and Allegra. The two convicts and their former guard are on the run after a prison break, which is teased early in the film on the news. They initially want nothing to do with Dan and Lisa, choosing to hide in the attic. When Dan and Lisa's fighting exposes them, the trio decides to make the best of their situation and take them hostage. Their efforts to extort money from Dan and Lisa reveal that all three are particularly sadistic, with their not-so-secret plans being to murder the pair as soon as they get what remains of their money. As the film progresses, the trio's frustrations with the duo lead them to actively attack them, serving as an external threat that unites Dan and Lisa. The trio is all impulsive and violent, in contrast to the more methodical approach that Dan and Lisa initially try to take to committing acts of violence. This creates an instant divide between them that allows some pretty horrifying things to happen in the film, both to make Dan and Lisa more sympathetic as they become victims and to excuse the grisly fates that they suffer. The trio is fairly straightforward and horrifying, making them an effective threat to Dan and Lisa. How Dan mans up to save himself, his wife, and his marriage. One of the major themes of Over Your Dead Body is the idea that Dan needs to take charge of his life. When he's introduced, Dan is a self-pitying director who can be pressured to redo takes on his commercial shoots, is constantly belittled by his father, and has come to resent his wife. A big part of Lisa's frustration stems from her belief that Dan has given up fighting for them, which left her to stew in her own frustration and anger. Dan comes to acknowledge his failings as his own, with the film seeing him become proactive in fighting the trio and helping save Lisa from an irate Todd. This more confident Dan proves capable of fighting against Pete and pulling the trigger on Aldra, but it isn't until Lisa actively chooses to save him too from sinking into the lake. The underlying message of the arc is that you have to be willing to fight for your loved ones if you want there to be a relationship. The darker subtext of Dan and Lisa's happy ending. On the surface, Dan and Lisa have a happy ending where they escape the cabin, kill their attackers, and rekindle their love for one another. They even use the events as inspiration for a new movie, revitalizing both of their careers. However, there is some darker subtext to this development that complicates the happy ending. Dan's father comes to investigate and is killed by Pete, albeit after wounding Aldra and killing Todd, which is treated as a wholly heroic deed in the aftermath, while likely massaging the fact that it was entirely because a neighbor noticed the lights on and he assaulted a nurse to escape his assisted care facility. There's also the matter of Henry. Dan's old friend and intended accomplice ends up fatally shot while Dan and Lisa wrestle with a gun. It's treated as another challenge for the pair to overcome. It's a dark realization of the idea that a healthy couple can overcome any challenge life throws their way, even if that includes hiding a murder. The true meaning of Over Your Dead Body. Over Your Dead Body is ultimately a movie about reconciliation and the realization that it takes a level of self-awareness and actualization to grow. The film spends a lot of time with Dan and Lisa in the second half of the film, highlighting how far they're willing to go for themselves and each other. Dan figures out how to break them free and tries to give her an opening to escape, literally fighting for them when he spent so long metaphorically giving up. While Dan gets more focus in the narrative, it's also true that Lisa gets a very similar arc as well. She bickers and berates her husband. However, she also has moments of vulnerability and proves willing to fight for them just as hard.